The day my grandmother died, my uncle called me to say I wasn't welcome at the house. Not the funeral, the house. He said, and I want to get this exactly right because I've replayed it 1,000 times. He said, "The family has decided it would be best if you gave everyone some space during this difficult time." I was her primary caregiver for 3 years. I had a key to her front door. I knew which drawer she kept her rosary in and which nights she needed someone to sit with her until she fell asleep. And the family had decided I needed to give them space. I said okay, because that's what I do. I said okay, and I hung up, and I drove to the grocery store because I had to do something with my hands, and I stood in the cereal aisle for 10 minutes not seeing anything. What I didn't tell my uncle was that 2 weeks before she died, my grandmother had pressed a sealed envelope into my hands and said, "Don't open this until the lawyer calls you." The lawyer called me 6 days after the funeral. My family had no idea that call was coming, and they had absolutely no idea what was inside that envelope. Welcome to Calm Drama Stories. My name is Renata Cross, and if you've ever been pushed out of a room where you had every right to be standing, stay with me, because sometimes the people doing the pushing don't know who's holding the door. I need to tell you who I was before any of this, because who I was matters to what happened. I grew up in a mid-sized town in Ohio, the second of 3 kids, the only girl. My older brother is Derek, my younger brother is Calvin, and for as long as I can remember, Derek was the one my family pointed at when they wanted to feel proud of themselves. Derek went to a good college. Derek became an engineer. Derek married a woman my mother described, without irony, as exactly what you'd want. At every holiday dinner for 30 years, Derek was the story my family told about themselves. I was the footnote, the one who stayed local, got a nursing degree, worked in home health care, never made the kind of money that gets mentioned at Christmas. I dated the wrong people for a long time. I lived in a small apartment. I drove a car that embarrassed my mother in her own driveway. Calvin, the youngest, never quite landed anywhere. He moved in and out of financial trouble, borrowed from everyone, and had a talent for showing up exactly when there was something to be gained and disappearing when there was work to be done. My grandmother, Loretta Cross, was my father's mother. She was 82 when she got her diagnosis, a slow, progressive thing that wasn't going to kill her fast, but was going to take things from her, piece by piece, until there wasn't much left. Her balance first, then her driving. Then the names of people she loved coming slower and slower, like a word on the tip of your tongue that keeps moving back. She had a house she'd lived in for 47 years, a modest savings account, a small collection of jewelry she'd been adding to her whole life, and 11 acres of land outside of town that had been in the Cross family since the 1950s. My Uncle Gerald, my father's brother, made it very clear from the beginning that he considered that land a family asset. He said family asset the way people say, my money, when it technically belongs to someone else. I didn't know it then, but everything that happened in the next 3 years, every dinner, every insult, every early morning and late night, was going to come down to a sealed envelope and a lawyer's phone call. It started the way these things always start. A fall. Grandma Loretta was alone in her kitchen on a Wednesday afternoon in November, and she slipped, reaching for something on a high shelf, and she lay on her floor for 2 hours before a neighbor came by and heard her calling. She wasn't badly hurt. A bruised hip, some shaken confidence, a doctor who sat her down and said the words that change everything. You shouldn't be living alone anymore. My father had been gone 8 years by then. Heart attack at 61, which meant Grandma Loretta's support system was, on paper, her 2 surviving sons, my Uncle Gerald and my Uncle Pete, who lived in Arizona and visited at Christmas when flights were cheap. In practice, her support system was about to become me. I won't pretend I was called to it by some noble impulse. I went because I got the neighbor's call first, and I lived 40 minutes away, and Gerald lived 20, and Gerald hadn't answered his phone. I drove over and helped her up and sat with her until she stopped shaking and made her tea. And somewhere in the middle of that, she took my hand and said, "I don't want to be a burden to anyone, Renata." I told her she wasn't. And then I drove home and called Gerald and told him what had happened. He said, "Well, that's what happens when she won't listen about the step stool. Thanks for handling it." Thanks for handling it. That was the beginning of 3 years of thanks for handling it. I want to tell you what handling it actually looked like, because people say caregiver and picture someone who stops by on Sundays with soup. This was not that. This was Monday, Wednesday, Friday mornings before my own shift started. This was calling the pharmacy when her prescriptions were wrong. This was sitting on hold with Medicare for 45 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon to sort out a billing error on a procedure she'd had in March. This was learning which of her friends had died and which had moved away, so I'd know who to call when she needed someone to talk to who wasn't me. This was the 2 a.m. phone call in February when she couldn't breathe right, and I drove over in the dark and sat with her, and it turned out she was fine, just frightened, and we watched an old black and white movie until dawn, and she fell asleep in her chair. This was learning that there is a particular loneliness that comes for elderly people in the early evenings, when the light changes and the house gets quiet, and that the best thing you can do for someone in that loneliness is simply be present in it with them. Gerald came by maybe once a month. He'd stay an hour, take a look around with proprietary eyes, ask questions about the land and the finances, and leave. Pete called from Arizona every few weeks and asked how she was doing in the tone of a man who needed her to say fine so he could move on. Derek and his wife sent gift baskets at holidays. Derek told me once, when I mentioned how much time I was spending, that he admired my lifestyle flexibility. He meant that I didn't have as much going on as he did. He meant that my time was worth less. I didn't say anything. I never said anything. I am, to my own detriment, not someone who fights in real time. I process later, alone, in my car in parking lots. What I did notice, what I started tracking in a part of my brain I couldn't turn off, was how everyone talked about Grandma Loretta's house and land. Gerald brought it up the most. He had a friend who was a developer, he said. The area was changing. The land wasn't worth what it was, but it could be, if it were handled correctly, if someone with vision got hold of it. He said this to Grandma Loretta with me sitting right there in her living room, and she'd nod and say she'd think about it, and after he left, she'd look at me and say, "Gerald always had vision, just never for the right things." She was sharper than anyone gave her credit for. Even toward the end, when names came slow and she lost days sometimes, she had a core of clarity underneath everything. She knew what she'd built, she knew what mattered, and she watched her family circle it for years, and she was taking notes the same as I was. One afternoon, about 18 months in, she called me into her bedroom and showed me a box. A shoebox, plain, slid under the bed. She said, "This is where I keep the real things." She didn't show me what was inside. She just wanted me to know it was there. I asked her if she wanted me to keep it safe for her. She thought about it for a moment and then shook her head. "Not yet," she said, "but soon." The end came in the way ends come, not all at once, but in a series of doors closing. First her balance went, more completely, and she needed a walker, and then a wheelchair for anything beyond a few steps. Then her words started taking longer to find. Then there were weeks where she'd wake not knowing what year it was. The doctor was kind and honest about what was coming. In the last 4 months of her life, I was there every day. And in those last 4 months, my family started appearing with a frequency that had nothing to do with how much they'd cared before. Gerald started coming by every week. He'd sit with her and hold her hand, which was genuinely touching. And then he'd corner me in the kitchen and ask about the will. Had she updated it? Had she talked to the lawyer recently? Did I know if she'd signed anything? I told him I didn't know, which wasn't entirely true. but I'd learned something from watching my family operate. The person who says, "I don't know," tends to get left alone. And I needed to be left alone to do the work. Derek came twice in those final months. Both times his wife came with him, and both times I noticed her photographing the house, just casually, on her phone, the way you photograph a place you're thinking about. The old furniture, the sunroom, the view of the property from the back window. My cousin Sherry, Gerald's daughter, whom I had not seen in 6 years, suddenly started calling me. Checking in on Grandma, she said, wanting to know how she was, asking questions about what her days looked like, what she was able to do. The questions weren't about Grandma's well-being. They were reconnaissance. Calvin showed up twice asking for money, not from me, from her, and I sat close enough both times to make sure Grandma understood what she was being asked and that she had a way to say no. I want to be honest about something. I don't think my family is evil. I think they're ordinary, and ordinary people sometimes behave badly around inheritance because inheritance sits at the place where love and money cross, and that's a treacherous intersection. What they didn't understand, what nobody understood but me and Grandma and her attorney, a woman named Susan Parrish, was that several months before the end, Grandma Loretta had asked me to drive her to Susan's office. Same as in this story you already know. I waited in the lobby. I didn't go in. I sat in a plastic chair and read a magazine I didn't absorb a word of. And an hour later she came out with Susan beside her. And Susan shook her hand and then looked at me and nodded, just once, the way professionals nod when they want you to know something without saying it. On the drive home, Grandma Loretta looked out the passenger window for a long time. Then she said, "I need you to know that what I'm doing with my whole mind. The parts that still work, which are the parts that count." I told her I knew that. She said, "Gerald is going to be very loud about this. I need you to be quiet until Susan tells you to talk." That was the whole conversation. 2 weeks later, she pressed the envelope into my hands. The night before she died, she was mostly not with me. But there was one moment, late, when she turned her head and looked at me with completely clear eyes and said, "You didn't have to stay." I told her I wanted to. She said, "I know, that's why." Then she went back to wherever she went, and she died before morning, and my uncle called to tell me I wasn't welcome at the house. The week of the funeral was the loneliest of my life. I'd been asked to give space, so I gave space. I sent flowers to the service. I sat in the back and left before anyone could ask me to. I went home and cleaned my apartment and tried not to think about the envelope on my kitchen counter. My cousin Sherry called the day after to let me know, very warmly, that the family was getting together at the house to go through things, and that they'd let me know if there was anything sentimental I wanted to claim. I said thank you. I didn't go. What I know happened at that gathering, I know from Calvin, who has always had the useful quality of telling me things he probably shouldn't, because he never learned to read a room. He called me that night, slightly guilty, and said everyone was in a good mood, that Gerald had talked to a developer friend, that Derek's wife had measured the sunroom. "What about the land?" I asked. Calvin paused. "Gerald said it's basically his already. He said Grandma always meant for it to go to her sons. He said you'd probably get some of the jewelry, and that would make sense because you were there a lot." Some of the jewelry. For 3 years of my life. I thanked Calvin and set my phone down and sat with that for a while. I didn't feel angry exactly. I felt what I'd felt in the cereal aisle after my uncle's call. A strange, hollow stillness, like the moment before weather arrives. Then Susan Parrish's office called. Her assistant said there would be a formal reading of the estate, that it was required given the complexity of the documents, and that I was specifically named as a required attendee. She gave me a date and a time. She said, "Ms. Parrish wanted me to mention, please bring any documents your grandmother may have given you for safekeeping." I looked at the envelope on my counter. Any documents your grandmother may have given you. I didn't sleep much that week. Gerald called 3 days before the reading. He was in his reasonable voice, his let's be adults voice, and he said he hoped there weren't going to be any surprises and that the family just wanted things handled smoothly and that he knew I'd been very devoted to Loretta, which was appreciated, and he hoped I understood that these decisions were complicated. I told him I understood completely. My brother Derek texted me the morning of the reading. "Hey, today might be emotional. Just remember we're all family." I texted back, "I know." I drove to Susan Parrish's office with the envelope on the passenger seat, unopened, still sealed the way Grandma had given it to me. I'd made it 6 weeks without opening it. Another hour wouldn't break me. The conference room smelled like good coffee and carpet cleaner. Gerald was already there, and his wife, and Sherry, and Derek and his wife, and Calvin, and a couple of other relatives I recognized from weddings and funerals. Pete had flown in from Arizona. They arranged themselves the way people do when they believe the outcome is already settled, comfortably, with the ease of people who've already agreed on how to divide something. I sat at the corner of the table. I put the sealed envelope in front of me. Gerald's eyes went to it and then away. Susan Parrish came in, set her files down, and said the thing lawyers say at the beginning of these proceedings. Then she looked around the table and said, "Before we begin the distribution of assets, I need to note that Mrs. Cross left specific instructions for how this reading would proceed. I'll be asking Renata to open and read aloud a document that was sealed and in her possession. This is per Mrs. Cross's explicit written instruction." Gerald said, "What document?" Susan said, "I'll explain as we go, Mr. Cross." He didn't like that. I watched him not like it. Susan began with the financial accounts, small savings, a CD that had matured, the contents of a checking account. She distributed these among the brothers, Gerald and Pete, and made a small bequest to Calvin. Then the jewelry, divided among the grandchildren, with specific pieces called out by name. She read my name for 3 pieces, a pearl bracelet, a garnet ring, and a locket with a photo of my father inside. I kept my face still. Gerald nodded like a man watching something go according to plan. Then Susan said, "Now we'll address the property, the house and the 11 acres. Gerald straightened. Susan continued. "Several months ago, Mrs. Cross met with me and completed a transfer on death deed for the property." She looked around the table. "For those unfamiliar with this instrument, it's a legal document that transfers real property directly to a named beneficiary upon the owner's death, outside of probate and outside the provisions of the will." Gerald said, "To whom?" Susan looked at me. "To Renata Cross," she said. Climax, 26 minutes, 30 minutes. You know how in movies there's always a beat of total silence before chaos? That beat is real. It exists. I lived inside it for approximately 2 seconds while the words settled. Then Gerald said, "That's not possible." His voice was already at the wrong volume. Susan, who had clearly been in rooms like this before, set her copy of the deed on the table and said, "It is, Mr. Cross. Your mother executed this document with full legal capacity, witnessed and notarized, at this office. Her physician provided written documentation of her cognitive status on the date of signing. Everything was prepared in accordance with Ohio law." "She was sick," Gerald said. "She wasn't herself at the end. Renata was there all the time. She had influence. She had—" "Gerald." That was Pete, from Arizona. Quiet voice. "Let her finish." Gerald looked at his brother like he'd been slapped. Susan said, "Mrs. Cross also asked me to note for the record that she anticipated this concern and addressed it specifically. The transfer was executed well before the period of her more significant cognitive decline. Her physician confirmed at the time of signing that she fully understood the nature and consequence of the transaction." Derek's wife said something quiet to Derek. He didn't respond. Calvin looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, something that took me a moment to identify as respect. Gerald turned to me. You talked her into this." "I drove her to the appointment," I said. "I waited in the lobby. I didn't know what she decided until this morning." That was true. I hadn't opened the envelope. I didn't know exactly what was in it. I only knew what Susan's assistant had said about documents. Gerald said, "I want to see proof." Susan slid the deed across the table, followed by the physician's letter. He read it. I watched his face while he read it, the movement through anger, into calculation, into something colder. He was doing the same math my family in the other story did. He was figuring out what a fight would cost. Then Susan said, "Mrs. Cross also asked me to read a letter aloud. She gave it to Renata in sealed form with instructions to bring it today." She looked at me. "Renata, would you open it?" I picked up the envelope. I'd carried it for 6 weeks. I slid my finger under the seal. Inside was a single folded page in my grandmother's handwriting, tighter and more careful than it would have been 2 years before, but completely legible. She'd written it while she still could. She'd planned this. I read it out loud the way she'd asked me to. "To my family, who I love even when it costs me something to say it. The house and the land go to Renata, because Renata is the only one who knew what they actually were. Not an investment, not an asset, not something to maximize, a place where a person lived a whole life. Renata sat with me while I lived the rest of it. That is the only qualification that was ever going to matter to me." To Gerald, "I know you're going to be angry. I know you're going to say she manipulated me. I want you to know that the day I went to Susan's office, I was clearer than I'd been in months, and I chose this. You have confused my illness with stupidity for 2 years. They are not the same thing." To Derek, "You sent nice baskets. I like the ones with the cheese." To Pete, "I wish Arizona wasn't so far. Call your grandchildren more." To Calvin, "Stop borrowing money. I say this with love and a closed checkbook." And to Renata, "You didn't have to stay. You didn't have to learn my medications and sit in the dark with me and drive me to appointments and hold my hand when I couldn't remember your father's face. I can't give you back the years. I can give you the land and the house and the knowledge that someone saw exactly what you were doing and found it worth everything. Keep the porch light on. All my love, Grandma Loretta." I folded the letter when I finished. Nobody spoke. Gerald put the deed down on the table and stood up and walked out of the room without a word. His wife followed him, then Sherry. Derek sat completely still. His wife had stopped talking. He looked at me across the table, and I saw something move through him. Not anger, not calculation. Something older and smaller. Something that knew better. "I didn't know," he said finally. "How much of it? I didn't know." I didn't tell him it was okay. It wasn't okay. But I nodded because he was trying to say a true thing, and that's somewhere to start. Pete, from Arizona, reached across the table and put his hand on mine for a moment. He said, "She picked right." Calvin cried a little, which I'd expected. Calvin feels things loudly. I passed him a tissue from my purse, and he laughed through it. Susan gathered her files and said if anyone had questions, her office was available. And then she gave me a quiet look that said what Gerald would never say, which was, "This is exactly what was supposed to happen." I drove back to the house, my house now, on paper, the way it had always been in practice. I unlocked the front door with the key I'd carried for 3 years and walked through the rooms and let myself feel the full weight of it. Not triumph exactly, but something steadier, something that has staying power. I turned on the porch light. Gerald did call a lawyer. The lawyer told him what Susan told him, and what was already true. A transfer on death deed with documented cognitive capacity is about the most secure form of property transfer that exists in Ohio law. There was nothing to contest that wasn't going to cost him more than it was worth. He hasn't spoken to me since the reading. That's been hard, in a way I didn't expect. He's my family. He was at my father's funeral. but some doors close from the other side, and you can't hold them open from yours. Derek came by the house in the spring. He stood in the front yard and looked at it for a while, and then he came inside and sat at the kitchen table and said, "I should have visited more." He didn't say it to apologize exactly. He said it the way you say a true thing when you finally admitted it to yourself. I made coffee. We sat in the kitchen where I'd spent 3 years managing medications and decoding Medicare statements and watching the seasons change through the window. We talked about our father a little, which we never do. We didn't fix anything, but we cracked a window. Calvin is Calvin. He's trying. He called me recently to tell me he'd gotten a job, a real one, benefits and everything, and he sounded the way people sound when they've surprised themselves. I told him I was proud of him, and I meant it. Pete does call his grandchildren more. He told me so. I live in the house now. The 11 acres are exactly what Grandma said they were. Not an investment, not a development opportunity, just land that has held a family for 70 years. I walk it sometimes in the early morning. I keep the porch light on. I'm still a home health nurse. I still drive a car my mother would have found embarrassing. I am not a wealthy woman by any measure my family used to measure things. But I have a porch light and a letter in my grandmother's handwriting, and the knowledge that someone I loved looked at everything I did, every 2 a.m. call, every pharmacy hold, every evening sitting with her in the dark, and decided it was worth something permanent. Her exact words were, "worth everything." I keep that folded in my nightstand. If you've been the one who showed up, who drove the 40 minutes and made the phone calls and learned the medications and stayed while everyone else sent baskets, I want you to hear this clearly. Being the one who stays is not evidence that you have less of a life. It is not proof that your time costs less or that you needed something to do. It is the hardest work there is, and it is the work that actually keeps people alive and dignified and loved. The people who see it will find a way to tell you. Sometimes they have to wait until a lawyer's office to say it out loud, but they see it. She saw it. Keep the porch light on. If this story moved you, share it with someone who shows up when it counts. Leave a comment telling me about the person in your life who stayed. And subscribe to Calm Drama Stories, because the quiet ones always have the most to say.